Okay, so I'm going to talk to you all about a paper of mine, which was published fairly recently, called Powering Up Neo-Aristotelian Natural Goodness. And I normally don't like to talk to groups, I guess, about things that I've already published, but other new things have been happening in our life. And this is our first daughter, Olivia, and she was born, I guess, 3 months ago, and she's basically taken up all my time. So sadly, that's what you've got this time. Something that you can, I guess, if you want to sort of work out more of the details or hear more of them, then head over to Phil Studies. It's an open access paper, and you can have a look at it. Or equally, if you want to tell me why I'm wrong, and you want to look at the details, then you can do that there as well. So the aim of the paper is to basically explore the relationship between powers, so a view in metaphysics, and neo-Aristotelian accounts of natural goodness. And that's basically to ascertain whether an account of this type of goodness can be given in terms of powers. And prima facie, it seems like there should be some type of link. Okay, and the reason for that, I take it, is that neo-Aristotelian goodness says that something's good insofar as it achieves its end, and powers generally are taken to be paradigm cases that have an end. Okay, and so this in my mind is making me think, oh, maybe there's something here. Maybe we can link these two things together. Okay. So why explore this? Well, one of the reasons is that there's a growing number of theorists who have a powers-only ontology, but they might still want goodness. So you can see below, I've got this image, which I found on some philosophy social media channel, of a load of contemporary power theorists. And some of them have a powers-only ontology, others actually have a few other things in them as well. But it seems like they want they still want things in ethics a lot of them want things in ethics to work out. So that's one reason. Another reason is there's this nice quote in a Schaffer paper, okay, where he's talking about his laser. And he says this: do not multiply entities without necessity. Few principles are as pervasive in contemporary metaphysics. Okay, so another reason that I'm thinking, oh, it'd be interesting to see if powers can do the job here, is because it's going to give us a simple view of the world. Like, if powers can do the job for goodness, then maybe we just don't need as much stuff in our ontology as we originally thought. And people generally seem to like that at the moment. Another reason is, often, I think this happens in arguments for powers as well, arguments for a certain metaphysic are kind of done on the basis of David Lewis style arguments, which is an argument from theoretical utility. So if I can show that this posit that I'm using can do loads of work, then accept this posit. Now, you might not like that type of argument. You might think it's no good, fair enough. But if you do like that type of argument, then if powers can do this job, then that's another reason that you might like powers. Final two reasons. So it's to bring two domains together that I don't think have interacted with each other all that much. And I think they should interact with each other more. And that's work within the power ontology literature, and then work within neo-Aristotelian theories of goodness. And I think that something similar could be said for, there's some work in virtue epistemology, which makes use of type of powery type things. And it would be nice to see some more engagement with the power metaphysics there as well. And then finally, I just take it to be an interesting question. And it's a question that I've thought about since my undergraduate days. And so actually putting pen to paper and seeing whether I can, whether it works out or whether it doesn't, is the other reason that I explore this.
Sorry, Ben, could you name the Power Rangers?
Can I name them? I can. So to the far left is Matt Tugby. Then we've got Michael Esveld. Then we've got, David Yates. Then we've got Anna Mamadouro. Then Stephen Mumford. And then Rani Andrum. So of the ones who just like powers, or just have powers in their ontology, Anna, Stephen, and Rani are probably the three. And then some of the others have powers and other things as well. As I say, I can't claim credit for creating this meme type thing, but I've sent it to a few of them and they've all found it quite funny. Okay, so the structure of the talk is going to go like this. I'm going to tell you a bit about the type of goodness that I'm interested in. I'm going to tell you a bit about powers. Then I'm going to tell you about how I see the relationship between powers and goodness. And then we're going to explore some more specific views. And you'll see what I mean by that as we go along. Okay, a provisional note, I guess, at the start. And that is to say that I don't defend either the view of powers put forward here or the general view of neo-Aristotelian goodness. Okay, so if you want to say, oh yeah, this all sounds great, but the view of goodness that you're thinking about is terrible, then I'm kind of like, okay, that's not my fight. My fight here is, do these two things, assuming that they're the case, can we link them together? And can they say some interesting stuff? So for the sake of the talk, I'm going to assume that they're true. Okay, so neo-Aristotelian goodness. What does this view say? So I think David Oderberg gives a nice kind of overview of this type of view. So he says the good is that which satisfies a thing's natural appetites or that which fulfills a thing's nature. So in terms of Oderberg's definition, natures have ends or can be fulfilled, and the good is fulfilling these natures. And if you've read any Aristotle, that you'll know that Aristotle says a lot of things like this, hence the name neo-Aristotelian views. Okay, and one thing I guess you guys who have thought about teleology a lot will probably already have some thoughts on this, but one thing to note is that the talk of functional end here is not meant to be statistical, but rather it's inherently naturally normative. So the thought is that eyes are for seeing, even if most people were blinded by some type of disease. Okay, they're just inherent in what it is to be an eye, is that it sees. Okay, and so that might lead you to ask the question, what accounts for the normativity of these natures or functions or ends? And this is where lots of people have posited teleology, or at least this is what lots of people have said was Aristotle's view. But more recently, some people have thought that teleology and normativity are inherently linked. So we've got Bauer, he says this: to ascribe a telos is to ascribe a norm or standard of performance. Rob Coons, he says normativity is generated by teleology. Your speaker from yesterday, he says teleological explanations are intrinsically normative. Okay, so I'm going to assume that all of this is right. So if you think it's not right, then you're not going to like the rest of what I say. But neo-Aristotelians do like this type of view, and I'm just going to take that on. So the bare bones version of neo-Aristotelian goodness therefore requires there to be a teleological end where this end is determined by the type of entity in question. So an example, a plant seed has a nature inherent to it, and this nature specifies the plant's teleological ends. And then, given that, there are three ways that I think we can think about goodness, okay? So the first type is called attributive goodness, okay? And this says the plant is a good plant insofar as it reaches these ends and bad insofar as it doesn't, okay? The second type of goodness is what I'm going to call relational goodness, and it concerns what is good for the plant. Okay, so what's good for the plant is soil, water, nutrients. Okay, and when the plant has that, then the plant is likely to reach its end and so reach its attributive good. And then finally is what I'm going to call derivative goodness. And that's going to say that something's good in virtue of X. So the leaves of the plant are derivatively good since they allow for photosynthesis to take place, which benefits the whole plant. So the type of goodness I'm going to be interested in here is attributive goodness. Okay, that's the most important one for me, and that's often because the other two relate to attributive goodness. They're like dependent in some way on it. But just, I guess, for to be complete, there is another type of goodness that people do think about, which is predicative goodness, and that just says that something's good simpliciter. Okay, and Aristotelians generally just reject this. Okay, they think that there's only goodness for a kind or of a kind or of a type. And Peter Geach is one of the famous people to have kind of started to argue against that view. Again, if you think that there is predicated type of goodness, just ignore it for the moment, okay? And finally, I'm going to limit my discussion even more, okay? So I'm only interested in natural goodness, okay? So Philippa Foot talks about natural goodness quite a bit. She then thinks that an account can be extended. And the reason I'm only going to talk about natural goodness is because, firstly, I think I'm already taking on a fairly big project, okay? And I think that moral goodness and artifactual goodness are going to require additional things and additional parts of discussion. And the reason you might think, oh, okay, I could see that for moral, but why artifacts? Well, it's because I think artifacts are probably metaphysically different from non-artifacts. Maybe the type of teleology they exhibit is different as well. And so maybe the type of account that I'm going to need to give is different. So I don't want to say that powers can't account for those, but it's just extra work that's not being done here. So powers, contemporary accounts. So there's four main things that you need to know if you don't know anything about powers. The four things are these. So first, powers are normally thought of as a type of property. A lot of these things are going to say normally or typically, and that's because, as in everything within philosophy, you can always find someone in the literature who says, no, they're a bit different. Okay, but they're normally thought of that way. Powers are typically defined by the change that they bring about, so that's their manifestations. Manifestations are thought to occur when a power is in certain circumstances, and then the fourth thing, powers are thought to exist even when they aren't manifesting. Now, the key thing, these are key things about powers, but I'm going to make use of another aspect of powers that many theorists think powers exhibit. And that is that they're directional entities, okay? They're directed towards ends. And how power theorists understand this varies, and there's two main views. Okay, there's the view called the physical or natural intentionality view. And that basically says there is this type of intentionality, which they call physical or natural, okay? It's similar to intentionality our minds exhibit, so it can direct towards things, but it's natural or physical, okay? And people like John Heil, C.B. Martin, they hold to this type of view. And then there's this other type of view, which says, actually, the way that we should understand directedness is in terms of teleology. And this is going to be an intrinsic type of teleology, so it's built in rather than extrinsic. And I'm going to opt for the teleological version here, okay? And this is, well, I should say as well, the intentionality account, some people, so again, like your speaker from yesterday, Mark seems to think that intentionality can kind of be explained in terms of teleology, okay? So teleology does the explaining of intentionality. And other people have thought that as well. Rob Coons has argued this in some place. There's some other people that I reference in the paper who do something similar. And so if that's right, and I don't claim to know enough about that whole area to know if it is right, then the type of intentional account is going to just become a teleological account. It's just a few more steps to get there. Okay, so some examples of people who think that powers are teleological entities are as follows, and they all speak about powers and dispositions, and I take it that they use these terms synonymously, as is often in the literature. So this is Rob Coons. He says causal powers are inherently teleological. To have the power to produce E in circumstances C is to have the C to E transition as one of one's natural functions. Here's Chris Austin. He's talking about powers in the context of biology. He says dispositions are understood as teleological or goal-directed properties, ones which are dynamically orientated towards these ends. And here's Nick Kroll. So he's got an interesting paper called Teleological Dispositions, if you want to give that a read at some point. He says to have a disposition just is to be in a state directed at a certain teleological end. Okay? And I often find it interesting that in some, I guess, corners of metaphysics, people say, teleology, no, it's terrible, it's gone, never again. And then in other areas, it's like, oh, no, it's fine, it's no big deal. I can remember saying to Anna Mamadouro in this paper, I gave it to her, and I had this line about, basically, don't think that this teleology is some type of mental thing. And she was like, why are you writing that? And I was like, well, because lots of people seem to think that any type of teleology has to be some type of mental thing, none of this sort of natural stuff. And she just thought it was crazy. Whereas if I speak to some of my other friends, they'd be like, no, that definitely needs to be in there. Why think it's some natural thing? So it's interesting how different people in different areas of philosophy have completely different views on these things. And that's why I like them speaking to each other. Okay, so powers and goodness. So my inspiration here comes from a bit of Liska's interpretation of Aquinas' natural law. Okay, so Aquinas has this sort of neo-Aristotelian view of goodness going on, and Liska gives his spin on it. He says a disposition power has as part of its very nature a tendency towards a specific end. This end, when realized, contributes to the well-being of the individual. Okay, and I can remember reading that during my undergraduate days, thinking, oh, I wonder if powers can like do it all, okay, when it comes to goodness. So powers, the thought is, powers have ends. They're essentially teleologically directed, because I'm taking the teleological account, and this provides it with natural norms. So if you remember, I said before, I was also taking it that teleology gives us norms, okay, like people have argued. Again, I'm being bad. I'm not arguing for that here. I'm just saying, like, assume these people are right, okay? And then we go from there. So neo-Aristotelian goodness thinks that something's good insofar as it fulfills its end. And then what we're going to get is, so a power achieving its end or manifesting is good. Okay, so that's kind of like the, I guess, the big background type ideas to how goodness and powers are going to relate. But then there's going to be complexities and worries that we can raise. You'll probably have others. And then what I'm going to try and do is finesse a view which maybe gives us everything that we want, okay, and removes things that we don't want. Okay, so first is a complexity that I must admit I'm not sure what we should say here. So you can all tell me afterwards what you think we should say. But here's kind of the worry. So what do we say about powers that don't manifest, but they don't because they're in the right conditions? They're not in the right conditions. So those which manifest that are in the right conditions are doing as they ought to, okay? So they're the ones that we say are good. Those which manifest in the wrong conditions are bad. They're not doing as they ought to, okay? Now, there's a big question as to whether the types of powers I'm thinking about can actually manifest in the wrong conditions, but we can come to that in a minute. But then it looks as though the powers that aren't manifesting because they're not in the right conditions are doing as they ought to do. And so it looks like, well, firstly, we might want to say that they're good, okay? So when a power isn't manifesting because it's not meant to, they're good, or we say that they're neutral. I mean, I kind of feel like the neutral view, I think Oderberg gives a view a little bit like this, kind of think, oh, well, why? Like, why shouldn't we say they're good? But at the same time, I'm worried by saying that they're good because then it looks like we've got loads and loads and loads of goodness in the world. We've got goods of powers not manifesting because they're not meant to. And if powers can only ever manifest in the correct conditions, they never manifest in the wrong ones, then they're always good. They're always just either not manifesting because they're not meant to, or they are manifesting because they're meant to. The types of powers that I'm thinking about. I think we probably have powers that we can manifest when we're not meant to, but maybe the natural world doesn't have powers like that. So another option would be to try and get rid of this kind of right conditions manifesting thing and adopt a view of powers which doesn't claim that powers are initially dormant, so not manifesting and then manifesting, but instead we say that powers constantly manifest and try and achieve their end. And Travis Dumsday, he attributes this type of view to Jonathan Lowe, and Anna Mamadouro, having spoken to her about this a bit, she says she's got a view a bit like this. But again, it just seems like powers are always doing what they ought to do then. They're always being good. And yeah, we might not want that to be the case. So I'm not sure what to say about this type of complexity. We'll leave that aside and go on to some other things that maybe I have some things to say about. So the first view that I want to think about is what I'm going to call the power trope view. okay? And so it's exploring the goodness, the neo-Aristotelian goodness, based on a world where there are just power tropes and there's no composition. And the reason why I don't want any composition is because sometimes when powers are talked about in the literature of Aristotelian goodness, they're kind of given this very derivative role, and such a role that you think, actually, you could get rid of powers here and you would get everything you need just from some object's nature and it being directed in a certain way, and then you could tell whatever story you want to about the properties that it has. So I'm saying, look, let's get rid of composition completely and let's just have power tropes, and then let's see what type of account we can get. Is it going to be any good? It's a view as well defended in literature, and as I talked about before, people like simple things at the moment, so maybe that's good. Maybe that's not, depends what you think of simplicity. Okay, so on this view, the attributive good of a power is it reaching its end, so namely manifesting, and the relational good for the power is that which helps the power reach its end. So I'm going to run through 3 different problems that I see with this type of account, and then they're the problems that are gonna I'm going to speak to when we think about some other accounts. Okay, so this is the first one. It's what I call the problem of permissiveness. And so do we really want to say, I guess it can be put as a question, do we really want to say that the manifesting of negative charge repelling other instances of negative charge in the correct circumstances means that the power has flourished and is good? Okay, I think lots of people are going to say no. Okay, we don't want to say that. I say that kind of as myself. I think I want to say maybe no to that. But there's actually quite a few neo-Aristotelian views of goodness who have some kind of what you might think of as odd views of what counts as good. So David Odeberg has this in, I think it's in his new book, which is all about the metaphysics of good and evil. He kind of thinks that instantiation is a good. Okay, now if you think instantiation is a good, then maybe you're going to think, oh well, this other thing that I've just talked about here, that doesn't look so odd or so bad either. I can kind of go along with that. So I mean, these objections are going to appeal to some people, and other people, I guess like all objections, other people are going to be like, no, it doesn't look that bad to me. I'm okay with that. Another worry you might have about this is that you might just think the view says the world is too good. Okay, so this comes back to my thing before. Like, it seems that when we want to give an account of goodness about the world, we kind of want it to be, I guess, realistic or match in some way up to our intuitions as to how good the world is. And if you think the world is a really crummy place, then maybe you think, no, Ben, you're giving far too much goodness here. I mean, equally, you might not be that worried about this either. So again, having chatted to Anna Mamadouro about some of this, she's like, no, I think the world is really good like this. So if you've got that type of intuition, again, you're not going to be that worried. But I guess the big question here for me is I think lots of people are going to be worried about this. And so the question is, can we restrict what the theory says is good? So one option would be to maybe say there's a type of teleology only living beings have. And only those types of beings can be said to be good, because it does seem we want to say living things can be good or bad. And remember, I've ruled out artifacts for the moment. So I'm thinking the other types of things that are going to be natural that we're thinking are we're not wanting to say are good or bad, are things like stones or things like, I don't know, natural things that are not living. Okay. And so often this type of teleology is put in terms of self-perfection. So people talk about metabolism as an example. So it perfects me, the metabolizing of the food that I've had helps me grow and stuff like that. But I mean, my question here is whether we can make sense of self-perfection on a non-compositional trope view, the view that I've adopted. And it seems really difficult to do that. Because there's no greater thing that it's perfecting. And if it is perfecting itself by manifesting, then all powers seem to pass the test, okay? So we don't kind of restrict the account. Another type of view, maybe we could say there's another type of teleology, okay? It does seem that in some of the literature, people think there's lots of types of teleology. But my question here is what type and why restrict it to this? And I don't know the answer to either of that, so I kind of just say no. Okay, the next worry is the bearer worry. So this is, what is the bearer of goodness? So on a power trope view, this is the power trope, okay? And you might think that seems odd. So what's going on in me when I say that there are things that are good? Well, there's no me on this view either, really. So there's just some trope in sort of this area that kind of is manifesting in a certain way. So when you say, oh, Ben is, I don't know, really intelligent, which is some sort of good feature, then you're talking about one of my tropes. Well, they're not mine, but a trope that's around in my area that's manifesting, and that's the thing that's good. And I think people are just going to think that this is really odd as well. This is going to be, I guess, a problem for any metaphysician that doesn't think there are objects when they come to ethics. Okay, what are the bearers of goods and bads? But it seems to be made worse on certain views of powers, at least in my mind. So there are certain views about what happens to a power when it manifests, okay? And on one view, what I'm going to call the jumping view of powers, and people like Alexander Bird and Stephen Mumford and Rani Anjum, who were on my Power Rangers earlier, they seem to have this type of view. They say that a manifestation basically produces a different power. So there's one power, and then when it manifests, another power comes about. And this often is thought to arise, there's this worry called the always packing, never traveling objection in powers, in the powers literature, that they never go from potency to act. They're always in potentiality. So we just go from one potentiality, and then it jumps to being another potentiality. So my concern here is that it means that the power which manifests is no longer in existence during or after the manifestation, since what we get is a different power instead. And as such, we can't attribute goodness to the initial power. Since post-manifestation, the thing that makes it good, it's not there anymore. And instead, we've got a different power. And it seems weird to me to say that that power was good, but the thing that is good now is this new thing. That seems strange to me. So one option here to kind of, I guess, defeat my latter worry is to adopt a different view of powers. So where manifestation of a power is about a power being in a different state. So it's exactly the same power, but when it manifests, it just turns into a different state. And that brings with it a whole host of other questions, like can we make sense of this view? What is it for a power to be in a state? But they are not questions to be addressed right now. Okay, the third worry, we had two permissive, so now why not have the opposite? So two restrictive. Okay, so attributing goodness to tropes alone doesn't seem to give us many of the types of goodness we prima facie seem to require and that neo-Aristotelians wish to embrace. So I kind of want to keep neo-Aristotelians on board here. I don't want to be like, look, adopt my view, although I'm getting rid of all your types of goodness that you liked. Okay, so think about the types of goods we usually attribute to organisms, such as their bodies functioning well in various ways. If we treat them as mere heaps of powers, it doesn't seem we can discriminate between bad or good states for an organism, and hence determining whether their bodies are functioning well. And the reason for that is what's usually doing the work there is something to do with the whole organism and its holistic functions, okay? And I've kind of got rid of that to just try and get a powers view off the ground. So I take it that probably the power trope view, while it's helpful in kind of teaching us things that we want and things that we don't want, is probably not the way to go. And so I'm gonna give it another try. And this try is to reintroduce objects. So I'm hoping objects can help us in overcoming the objections raised. But as I've said to you before, I don't want it to be that now that I've reintroduced objects, powers basically don't play the role anymore that I want them to. I want powers to do all the work. That's the exploration, can they? So you might worry that I failed by reintroducing objects, but I'm hoping I don't need to. So this is Mamadouro. She writes this. She says, either assume objects and show them to be powerful, or assume powers and show how objects consist of them. Power structuralism follows the second path. The present paper, her own, aims to show how objects are built out of powers. So I'm going to try for the second option, okay? I want to try and build objects out of powers, and then I can basically say, look, it all comes down to powers, okay? And there are actually a number of ways that different theorists have built objects from powers. So I'm going to briefly talk about a few. Okay, so first is Mike Ray, and it is going to be really brief, okay? So apologies, I can point you to their papers if you want to know a bit more about them. So he takes the natures of objects, which he thinks are the most important thing, to be fundamental powers, and that these natures of composite objects unite other powers, okay? They unite the powers around them. For example, he considers humanity to be a biological nature, so a power, and he thinks that the manifestation of humanity in a region depends causally upon a particular sort of cooperative manifestation with the simple parts of the human organism, namely its constituent powers. So you can see here that powers are doing the work all the time. They're just almost a different type and doing different jobs. Okay, another person, Vorsky. So, and I should say all these views, bar the last one, are kind of hylomorphic views, okay? They're hylomorphic views that want to say that powers play the role of form and also powers play the role of matter. So they're kind of doing everything. So Jaworski, he takes forms, what he calls structures, to be powers, and powers to configure, organize, order, or arrange an object's material parts into a single whole, which he takes to be distinct from other objects. So he says basically that these single wholes are emergent individuals, which are essentially engaged in the activity, which is the manifesting of this power, which is structural form, or configuring the materials that compose them. And again, the materials that compose them are powers, okay, which are its constituents. So powers are just doing the job there. Rob Coons, he thinks that he's got a similar view in a sense to Jaworski, but he also allows that there can be fundamental causal powers at the macro level. And the reason that he allows this is because he wants powers to exhibit a top-down metaphysical grounding, so that the top-down can kind of do stuff more than Jaworski's view. Let's see. Okay, then we have Mamadouro. Okay, she says that powers exist in structures, and she thinks that there are two different types of structures. She says there are structures that unite, and she calls these, she thinks that there are specific powers attached to these different types of structures. So the structures that unite are called structural powers, and they unite powers when they come together into physical structures. And then she's got this other type, which are structures that unify, and she calls these substantial powers, and they do the unifying goal. And basically they turn multiple powers into one, okay? So for the structural powers, what they do is they bring about some unity between many powers due to there being ontological dependencies between these powers, okay? And that's what she thinks a structural power is. Whilst the substantial power does something like a lot more, okay? It brings about a change in the individuation criteria of multiple powers, and thereby a change in their ontological status. So they don't exist anymore as a multitude, but rather they're re-identified and unified into one power, okay? So with all the power parts, because there aren't really any parts anymore, okay, depending on their identity of this substantial power, they all just become one thing, okay? And for her, that's the sense in which they're unified. Is, like she says, it's a very strong sense of unity or unification. And then finally, so this is the one view that's not really hylomorphic, although I think Dumsday thinks it is in ways, but it's less clearly hylomorphic than the other views, is Travis's view. So his view relies on what are called multitrack powers. So briefly, multitrack powers are different from single-track powers in that single-track powers have one type of manifestation or end. That's how I'm thinking about them anyway, okay? So let's say negative charge, its end is just to repel other things that have negative charge or something like that, okay? It's just got one. And for any different type of manifestation, there's going to be a different power, okay? Whereas multi-track powers have more than one type of end, okay? Or more than one type of manifestation, okay? That's the distinction here. And Dumsday's thought is this. He says, perhaps the negative charge, half integral spin, etc. of an electron are all manifestations of one multitrack power. to give rise to such properties in the object upon that object's receiving an appropriate external causal stimulus. So on a Domesday-inspired view, let's say that a multitrack power is all that grounds the essential aspects of a composite object, okay? And it's in that sense that I mean that it is the object, okay? Okay, so given these types of views, and I'm going to group some of them together, how can they respond to the worries that we thought about before? So the bearer worry, let's start with that. So the worry was that we didn't have the right bearer of goodness. So it was a power trope and should have been an object. Okay, so the accounts given above largely solve that worry. What makes something good is the manifestation of these powers, which in some way, and I've talked about a few different ways, they compose an object. The multitrack view still seems to have an issue, since we're still attributing goodness to a property, okay? So it's just this thing, the multitrack power. I guess what we could try and say here is that maybe it's a substance or an object if it's a freestanding trope. So the trope is not attached to anything. Keith Campbell, a number of years ago, had a view like that, and there's quite a few people today who have those types of views. Now, maybe you could say, oh, it's not an object, but I'll call it an entity. And maybe if you call it an entity, that's good enough for me. I don't know. But the worry might be there that couldn't the power trope view that we started above say something similar? Maybe it can. Maybe it can get out of that concern as well. Okay, the next objection, we're doing these in a slightly different order from the way that I introduced them. But here's the next one, is the too restrictive objection. Okay, so if you remember, I said, look, this view seems to get rid of a load of goodness, types of goodness that the neo-Aristotelians want. Well, now by reintroducing objects, hopefully we can get goods of the whole organism, okay, rather than just individual tropes. So on the first four accounts, this is because they have what I'm going to call a primary power, okay? And this is a type of power, and they all speak about it in different ways, but the job it does is to unite or configure or ground or unify its constituent powers into an individual, okay? And as I say, they do it in different ways, and it would be interesting to do a deeper dive into whether some of these views work better for the ethics than others, okay? But for the moment, I'm taking them in a wide sense. So the primary power provides these constituent powers in some way their new holistic function, okay? And as such, the goods of the object can be to do with how well this primary power achieves this end, namely of continually bringing about this result and how well the constituent powers achieve their new holistic function, okay? So now I can get the goods of the animal or the plant or whatever, not just tropiness. So on the multitrack view, the essentials of an organism are grounded in a multitrack power. So the multitrack view is going to have to say something a bit different because of it doesn't have a primary power. And so the goods of the organism depend on which tracks are manifesting and whether they are manifesting in the correct circumstances. And I'm thinking that on the multitrack view, given what organisms can do, we might want a type of multitrack power, and that's one that can manifest its tracks, more than one of its tracks simultaneously. Okay, so some multitrack powers seem to be of the sort that if one track manifests, it prevents the other ones from manifesting. And other multitrack powers want to say, no, actually, if one track manifests, other ones can as well. Okay, and I'm thinking for an organism, given all the things it can do, it looks to me like it would be one of the second type. Okay, and that's a very weak looks. So maybe if we did some proper empirical research, it'd turn out it wouldn't be that way. Okay, we could then say that some of the tracks of this power require the manifestation in other tracks to achieve their end. So I'm thinking now that maybe there's some dependencies going on between these tracks within this one power. So manifestation track A can only manifest if manifestation track B does manifest, but B can manifest whether A, B, or C manifests or not. Okay, and then given this, what I want to say is that maybe this helps us make sense of other types of good and bads that the Aristotelian theory of goodness wants to, and we can say that what's bad about a broken arm, okay, which seems something difficult to say on the power trope view, is that it prevents other tracks of the multitrack power from manifesting. And why does it do that? Well, because they're going to be dependent on the arm from doing its job. okay? And they can't manifest now because, well, my broken arm is preventing those tracks from manifesting because of the dependencies. Okay, so that's my kind of way to think about how a multi-track view can maybe get more of this type of goodness. Okay, problem of permissiveness. So I guess this was the main worry that I started with. So perhaps we could say that only the powers that unite, configure, ground, blah, 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 unify an object, and the constituent powers of the object may be good. This is going to rule out lots of powers, okay? So those powers not making up objects, they're not going to be good and bad anymore. On Mamadouro's structural powers view, just to let you know, this is still going to be too permissive for lots of people. So she thinks grains of sand on a beach, they can compose a structural power because there's going to be ontological dependencies between the powers there in the grains of sand. Okay, but on unification views, which is her substantial power view and the Ray and Vorsky and Coons view, it's going to rule out a lot of stuff. Okay, but you still might think it's too permissive. Okay, these objects still come in living and non-living. And again, the question is, do we want to attribute goodness to non-living things? Now, as I said before, or earlier in the talk, maybe you do. Maybe you want to say, yeah, there can be goodness attributed to non-living things that are not artifacts, a bit like Oderberg did when he's thinking about instantiation. But if you don't like that, then maybe we're gonna need to try and restrict it to, I guess, only living things. So on this, thinking about this, you could do so based on a view of composition. This was something that was, I guess, put to me by one of the reviewers of the article. He wanted to say maybe we could say there's a type of composition of living beings that is more holistic, or I can't think of the right words now, but it unifies it in such a way that goodness is far more easily attributed to it than other types of composition. Another thing maybe we can say is we can talk back to the type of life teleology mentioned above, the self-perfection. I mean, that now seems to make sense to me on these type of object views, because there is this thing that's when the power manifests, it's perfecting, if you like, the primary power. Okay, it's perfecting itself, the constituent powers, when they manifest. And we can now make sense of this self-perfection as being something distinct from just a power manifesting, which I said we couldn't make sense of on the power trope view. Okay, on the multi-track power view, it seems a bit harder, and it seemed a bit harder, lots of the things on the multi-track view. The reason why it's harder, I guess, is why not all the multi-track powers? Because that's now the thing that determines whether the thing's an object or not. So one suggestion here would be to claim that only those multi-track powers which have tracks that are dependent on the manifestation of other tracks count as objects. So I talked about those types of multi-track powers earlier, okay, when I was trying to get extra types of goodness into the account. I mean, a concern here is why just restrict it there? It seems a bit ad hoc. It also seems pretty permissive, okay? It doesn't seem that only living beings would have those types of powers. I mean, again, maybe that's up to empirical investigation. Perhaps then we can make the self-perfection move again, but on the multi-track view, I'm not sure how that would work. And does it ultimately just become the dependency move again? So it's self-perfected because it affects another one of the tracks, but then it just seems like I'm saying what I said in the above bit. So again, if you have any suggestions on that, then do let me know. Okay, so final thought is what I'm going to call the infected leg scenario. So it's a type of thought that neo-Aristotelians want to answer about goodness, and so my account needs to answer it as well. And I also think it raises some questions for some of the accounts that I've given. So imagine my leg becomes so infective that unless I remove it, the infection will spread to the rest of my body and cause me permanent serious illness and eventual death. What do I do? Okay, on the primary power account of objects, the manifestation and continued manifesting of the power that unifies my body is the primary end, okay? Since it makes me a human being and it makes me do everything. And given this is the most important, and so I remove my leg. But what type of power is the primary power, okay? Is it a single track power or is it a multi-track power? So often this isn't something that's discussed by the first 4 accounts, I think. Often the multi-track, it appears multi-track. So Vorsky's structure, his primary power does multiple things, okay? Rays seem to imply the same when he speaks of a complex power. So it's not power just for one end, it's a power that's doing all these different things all at once. On multi-track views then, we're going to have to work out how to order the tracks in terms of importance. So I need to know which track is the one that kind of, basically, does my effective leg come lower in importance of the tracks that manifest compared to my body kind of functioning? I mean, that seems obvious, but then it seems that we're going to get to a place where it becomes less obvious. And we also might worry, is it then just going to turn into a whole multi-track view, the type of accounts that Ray and Vorsky give, and have some of the problems that I said that Domesday type view has. On the single track view, difficulties are also going to arise regarding order. So remember, on the single track view, it's just going to be for every different type of goodness, okay, natural goodness, there's going to be a different type of power that brings about that goodness, okay? And now I'm going to need to work out what's the order of single track powers in terms of fundamentality when thinking about this type of organism. So if I'm taking Anna view, which seems to be more single track. So perhaps the answer to both of these are not answers that philosophers are meant to give, and instead they're answers that empirical sciences are meant to give. And I think sometimes neo-Aristotelians about goodness do appeal to that type of thing. So maybe I shouldn't be asking these questions. I should be leaving that to the scientists. So to conclude, have we got an acceptable account going where powers can give us an account of, I guess, natural goodness on a neo-Aristotelian view? I don't know. I'm inclined to say we've got some options, and maybe we can get all we need just from powers. I mean, at least in the paper, that's how I conclude it. But I think that there are lots of, and I say this in the paper as well, this is kind of the start of a bigger project. So there are lots of additional questions to be answered and details to be worked out, such as which of the views, I gave you all these different views of objects, which of the views are best? Like it could be that the multi-track view is ruled out by some of the concerns that I had, but then it could be that some of the primary power views, given the ways that they set up their accounts, some are clearly better than others. And I don't know the answer to that at the moment. But yeah, there we go. That's powering up neo-Aristotelian natural goodness.